Okay, so today I wanted to talk about Ozu and Bresson, two of my favorite filmmakers, and two filmmakers who surprisingly actually have a lot in common. The first thing you'll notice about Ozu's films will most likely be that they all kind of look the same. Over the course of his career, he established a very rigorous and almost systematic directorial style, resulting in very, very little variety across his films, especially the post-war films, which is where his signature style really solidified itself, really became codified, to the point where his films just become this kind of never-ending series of combinations and variations of familiar elements. And I'm talking about style, but of course this is true of the content of his films as well, the subject matter. And yet, despite this strict, systematic approach, Ozu's films are full of brief moments that stand out to me, moments that don't quite seem to belong to the established order. When watching his films, rather than being bored by the uniformity of his style, I find myself constantly on the edge of my seat, because every single shot, no matter how strictly composed it may be, no matter how perfectly measured out every single aspect is, every shot seems to contain something deeper, some kind of potential, the nature of which for a long time I couldn't quite put my finger on. That was until I watched his 1950 film, The Munekata Sisters. There's this one scene in this film where the two titular sisters are visiting a temple, and they're just sat talking for a while until they eventually leave, and we see the younger sister kind of lagging behind, so the elder sister tells her to hurry up. A pretty conventional dialogue scene, shot the way you would expect Ozu to shoot a dialogue scene. But it's how he chooses to end this scene, how he punctuates it, that stands out to me. And that has, for whatever reason, become emblematic in my mind of Ozu's little stylistic flourishes. As soon as I saw it, I knew there was something about this shot that for some reason felt representative to me of what I find to be kind of experimental about Ozu's style, and for a few days I couldn't stop thinking about this shot, this simple lateral tracking shot through some trees, but I couldn't quite figure out why. The shot stands out for one obvious reason, which is that Ozu barely ever moves his camera. This is one of the main formal constraints of his style. He does move it sometimes, perhaps even more than people realize, but whenever he does it, it obviously leaves an impression. And you immediately start to wonder, why did he move the camera? Why for this specific shot? And that's the real question here, the underlying question of everything I'm going to be talking about. What motivates a shot? What motivates a stylistic decision? Why did Ozu decide to break his usual formula and move his camera in this one moment? What was so special about these trees? And the thing is, the more Ozu films you watch, the more you realize that his films are full of small moments like this. Brief moments that make you wonder, why did he do that? There's another example in the same film actually, a dialogue scene between three characters in an apartment, and when one of the characters leaves, the shot just kind of lingers on the door for a few seconds before cutting to the next shot of the woman arriving downstairs. Now, there is a practical purpose we can read into these kinds of shots. For example, the duration that Ozu creates in this shot serves as a good transition to the subsequent scene, giving the character time to arrive downstairs rather than cutting directly to it. Even if it's only a few seconds, it kind of manages our spatio-temporal perception. And similarly, the shot of the trees earlier on serves as a smooth spatial transition from one location to the next. The camera slowly gliding away from the temple as we leave that location, then cutting back to the city. There's also the compositional aspect. Ozu loves vertical lines in his images, and so in this scene we go from the pillars of the temple to the tree trunks, and finally to the tall buildings and vertical imagery of the city. Now, these are very basic, practical readings of the purpose of these scenes, and I think that on one level they are definitely correct. They are valid. I think Ozu was a filmmaker who thought about his craft more than anything else. So these readings are probably the closest we'll get to some kind of intentionality. And yet these explanations don't quite feel right. They don't feel sufficient. They explain one possible motivation, one possible purpose, but I feel that they don't fully explain the effect of these shots. They explain the craft without explaining what Ozu's craft evokes in the viewer. And so what we need is a more global view, a sense of how these scenes, these choices resonate with Ozu's work as a whole, his entire aesthetic project. And so what about Bresson? The first thing you'll notice about Bresson's style will most likely be the unconventional acting, which can be quite off-putting at first. We don't really know how to deal with this kind of performance. We don't know what to think, what to feel. It's strange, it's kind of unnatural. Every actor performs with the same kind of emotionless, almost robotic tone, all the way down to their actions, their gestures, which feel very stilted and over-rehearsed. And of course, Bresson's cinematography is also very consistent, and while it may not be quite as systematic as Ozu's, it's perhaps even more eccentric. It's not so easy to predict how Bresson will direct a scene, in contrast to Ozu, but when you watch a Bresson film, you feel that that was the only way it could have been directed. There's a kind of inevitability to Bresson's cinematography, almost like it could only ever be seen in this one way. This makes sense because Bresson himself has stated that when choosing a shot, he looks for the one angle that suggests every other angle. So we see that for Bresson there's a right way and a wrong way to shoot a scene, and that way, that method, pre-exists the individual film and the individual shot. It stems from Bresson's personal philosophy that guides and shapes every stylistic decision he makes, and that method is rooted in what Bresson calls automatism. But before we get into what Bresson means by automatism, we need the last piece of the puzzle here, which is David Bordwell's notion of parametric narration. In his book Narration in Fiction Film, Bordwell goes over a variety of different ways films tell their stories, and one of those ways, and perhaps the most unconventional, is the parametric style. For Bordwell, parametric narration is essentially what happens when form becomes detached from content, when style starts to follow its own internal logic rather than being subservient to narrative. He writes that a film's stylistic patterning splits away from the sujet, meaning the plot, the story, when only artistic motivation can account for it. That is, if the viewer cannot adequately justify the stylistic work as necessary for some conception of realism, for transtextual ends such as genre, or for compositional requirements, then he or she must take style as present for its own sake, aiming to become palpable as such. In short, it's when the style of a film, the directorial choices, seem motivated by something other than the content, the narrative, the themes, the characters. And Bordwell contrasts this with what he calls art cinema narration. He writes that the urge to read stylistic effects in this way must also be traced to a broader tendency, that of assuming that everything in any film, or any good film, must be interpretable thematically. Thematization of this sort typically loses the specificity of a film's narrational work. Every stylistic element gets read the same way. Long shots unite characters, cuts divide them, vertical lines isolate or split a character, horizontal lines evoke freedom, point of view shots create power relations by making one character the object of another's look. This parametric style can be very difficult for people at first because it's particularly resistant to this kind of thematization of style. Instead, it seems to exist for its own sake. It embodies a method, an approach, a kind of working philosophy, rather than simply analogically representing the underlying thematic content of a scene. And of course, there are plenty of examples we could give to illustrate this parametric style, and Bordwell goes through quite a few, but what interests me here is specifically the effect produced by Ozu and Bresson's particular kinds of parametric narration. What is the purpose of this unity of style? What does it accomplish exactly? Well, we find one answer in this Bresson interview where he says that he tries to depict his characters in a similar way, first of all in order to achieve a kind of unity, which is to say the most difficult thing to accomplish when making a film, which is to not become scattered. The film is already all over the place, so you have to try and assemble everything in order to get that unity that's so essential if you want to touch the viewer, really move them. There's also one other very important aspect, which is that the more two things look alike, the more different they become, in the sense that you see the differences more clearly. It's precisely in trying to give a kind of similarity, a kind of unity to my characters, that they gain individuality, difference. And so this brings us back to the concept of automatism. Bresson imposes his order onto the space and the characters only in order to reveal something, to discover something within them.
Pourquoi ne laissez-vous pas alors les personnages que vous prenez? Mais pourquoi ne laissez-vous pas alors les personnages que vous prenez, vous ne choisissez pas du tout au hasard, improviser un peu plus?
Mais ils improvisent, mais pas de la façon que vous pensez. C'est-à-dire que je voudrais que l'esprit soit absolument en dehors de ce qui se passe. C'est-à-dire qu'on rabâche, qu'on répète 50 fois s'il le faut, de façon que l'esprit ne prenne plus part, ni aux paroles, ni aux gestes. Et une fois que cet automatisme est là, lancez le personnage dans l'action du film. Il se passe des choses absolument imprévisibles, mais qui sont 100 fois plus justes qu'elles ne le sont au théâtre, où l'acteur a appris par cœur des textes et pense son texte et pense ses gestes. Il n'y a aucune chance pour qu'il tombe juste.
Et là, vous avez quelquefois des gestes inattendus de la part de vos interprètes.
Tout le temps. Voilà l'imprévu. Mais l'imprévu n'est pas au moment... On ne peut pas copier la vie. Il faut essayer de trouver un truc pour arriver à la vie sans la copier. Si on copie la vie, on n'arrive pas à la vie, on arrive à quelque chose de faux. Et c'est par un mécanisme que je crois qu'on peut arriver à une vérité et même à une réalité. Dans le travail du cinéma actuel, quand on place des objets ou des personnages, c'est en fonction de leur action dramatique, c'est-à-dire c'est en fonction de l'art dramatique. On les place ici ou là, selon ce qu'ils ont à dire ou à faire, d'un point de vue tout à fait théâtral. Pour moi, la place et l'ordre dans lequel on met les gens, les plans dont vous venez de parler, sont l'expression même du cinéma, beaucoup plus importante que cette action dramatique qui, au fond, ne se révèle que par rapport à ces plans, c'est-à-dire à la forme. Et c'est cette forme cinématographique qui est importante et qui doit passer avant tout. C'est-à-dire que quand vous composez un plan, c'est ce plan qui doit, cette composition qui doit exprimer quelque chose avant même les personnages. Ces plans doivent avoir en eux-mêmes la valeur d'une idée. C'est-à-dire que j'aime toujours voir et entendre le film avant de tourner. Trouver des choses tout seul, entre quatre murs, qui sortent de ma mémoire ou de mon imagination, et pour ensuite être capable aussi de ne pas les tourner, mais ce sont souvent des choses que je ne trouve pas sur place en tournant. Donc il faut aussi, je crois, une base très solide, faire des barrières entre lesquelles le film doit être fait. C'est pour cela d'ailleurs que je peux, connaissant ces barrières, que je peux demander à mes acteurs de me faire une surprise, mes acteurs non professionnels de me faire des surprises, mais c'est-à-dire des surprises infinies dans un cadre fini.
So basically, Bresson is attempting to rid cinema of all theatricality, of all intentionality in the performance, all psychologism, through his particular kind of parametric style, his automatism, which serves to flatten the hierarchical relation of form and content in film. Style is no longer subservient to narrative or to an actor's theatrical performance. Rather, the actor's performance becomes just one sign, one system of signification among others. A performance is broken down into rhythms, patterns, assigned a kind of poetic meter. And of course it's no surprise that we find a similar approach in the way Ozu directed his actors. In Ozu and the Poetics of Cinema, Bordwell writes that dialogue had to be recited exactly as written, and Ozu would insist on many repetitions to remove excess emotion. He saw as part of his task the restraining of feeling. Quoting from Tadao Sato's book on Ozu, he writes, "Get rid of all the dramatics and show a sad character. Without using drama, make the audience feel the emotion." Ozu's directing thus ruled out empathetic interpretation. The actor became a repository of pictorial behaviors. And now quoting Donald Ritchie, "You are not supposed to feel, you are supposed to act." We can see that this is pretty much exactly the same philosophy as Bresson. Both of these filmmakers were interested in emptying out the emotion from the actors' performances in order to elevate them to the realm of formal patterns, a kind of musical rhythm. In short, they were more interested in the form of the thing as it exists in this new medium of cinema, rather than attempting to recreate a kind of theatrical naturalism. But the thing is, Ozu's subjects, his stories, are so ordinary, so rooted in everyday Japanese life, that the effect of this consistent, unnatural style is necessarily one of defamiliarization. He says as much himself. You must cinematize that life which so easily becomes flat. More than anything else, actual Japanese life must be made more filmic. His goal is to defamiliarize ordinary Japanese life, and Bordwell adds to this by saying that Ozu's accomplishment consists of taking a limited set of familiar materials and transforming them by means of a unique formal system. Through the work of this formal system, certain reference and commonplaces become deepened and enriched. He poeticizes the post-Meiji modernity, the city, the economic milieu of his characters, their family situations, all fairly stock materials, are revivified. Like the Rita who amplifies and intensifies set topics, Ozu uses plot and style to make well-worn things fresh. And I think it's those small moments, those anomalous scenes that we described in the beginning, that can be seen as the ultimate embodiment of this general project of defamiliarization. These scenes stand out precisely because of the general uniformity of Ozu's style. You can't help but notice them, and they stand out all the more because they don't seem to be saying anything. They don't convey an idea or a theme. They're almost like gaps in the conventional flow of the film, a kind of intermission that makes you take a step back and reframe your perception of the film. He regularly creates these short moments where the viewer is brought to teeter on the edge of some kind of void, a place that refuses interpretation and yet demands to be seen, a persistence of vision. It's there that we feel the true depth of this defamiliarization. We feel kind of disoriented, destabilized, because it confronts us with a deeper truth that underlies our daily lives, but of which we remain ignorant. And that truth is that these characters and their stories are just passing through. They belong to a greater, transcendent movement. These lingering shots show us the world without the characters. They empty out the narrative, leaving only pure space and duration, which is to say, pure cinema. They make us step out of the drama, if only for a second, forcing us to contemplate the underlying feeling of melancholy present in every story, every life even, which stems from the impermanence of our human drama, and Ozu's camera captures that impermanence. And see how this is also a kind of thematic analysis, but one that does not interpret the form based on the content of the particular scene or even the particular film, but rather interprets the form in light of Ozu's entire filmography, his general tendencies, his framework. You could say it's a thematic analysis of Ozu's craft, because it's the craft itself and how the craft shapes his stories that evokes these themes, that evokes these feelings in the viewer. Instead of a symbolic case-by-case reading of individual stylistic choices, we get a broad, sweeping vision which encompasses the particular story seen in the film but is not limited to it. Thus the feeling of transcendence. All of this belongs to the same movement. For Bresson, spiritual, religious, and for Ozu perhaps simply philosophical or formal. But in both cases, the particulars of the films get swept up in a larger vision, a life, the life of the filmmaker.